A terrible war is raging within the galaxy. The Sith Lord Count Dooku is weakening the Republic little by little with his relentless attacks, and General Grievous has kidnapped the leader of the Galactic Senate, Chancellor Palpatine. To make things worse, a zombie apocalypse is on the rise. Could things get any worse? Location: Planet Odashir, Faustin, Sith Academy. Time: unknown. Shortly after the establishment of the Academy in the year 4644 BBY, its founder Darth Dreer began his plans to create a Sith temple, so he could focus on his experiments in peace. With each experiment, or rather each failed experiment, Dreer became even more frustrated. He just did not understand what he was missing. What did he need to do in order to achieve immortality? Dreer's obsession with the concept of immortality was something many Sith Lords had in common. They all wanted to cheat death, but Dreer vowed to be the one to do just that. And one day, the Sith Lord believed he found a solution, a formula he created that was supposed to grant the user eternal life. That is, if the user performed a series of specific rituals. With each step he took in producing his elixir, Dreer recorded it all in what was known as a Sith holocron. One of the primary uses of a holocron was to open temple doors, but it can also be used to store information, and it can only be accessed by those of the dark side. A very handy tool, and Dreer was going to take full advantage of it. He just hoped that his findings would prove useful to future Sith Lords. If Dreer decided to disclose this information, of course. It took some time, but the Sith Lord was close to completing his elixir. It just needed one more ingredient. Dreer looked to the other side of the table he was working on, and there laid a beautiful flower with black petals. A Murakami orchid. It is said that the orchid will only bond with those who had a similar concentration of midi-chlorians. Not only that, but apparently the orchid could also speak to the one it was bonded to through the use of telepathy. Usually Jedis are the ones to bond with the Murakami orchids, but Dreer seemed to have found a way to use the flower's properties to his advantage. The Sith Lord cut the petals of the flower, which were surprisingly brittle despite its still lively appearance, and he proceeded to grind the petals into a dark powder. He then added the powder into the elixir he had in a test tube. The originally red mixture quickly turned into a deep magenta the moment the powder was included. Once the elixir was complete, Dredd wasted no time in digesting the product. He was confident in his skills in Sith alchemy, so he was not worried about anything. At first, the Sith Lord did not feel any different after consuming the elixir, but the next moment Dreer's entire body felt hot, and he even began to sweat profusely. He then started feeling noxious, and he steadied himself by placing his hand on the table. But Dreer was shocked to see that his skin had turned into a sickly, pale gray, almost like that of a corpse. Was this a side effect of the elixir? Was he dying? Location: aboard the Invisible Hand. Time: 1:23 p.m. 19 BBY. Two interfighters crash-landed onto the docking bay of the enemy's flagship just before the doors slammed shut. They slid across the floor and unintentionally hit some of the droids that happened to be inside, sparks flying as their bodies quickly became scrap metal. But before they even stopped, the canopy of one of the ships suddenly opened, and from the cockpit, a Jedi Master sprung into action. With his blue lightsaber in his hand, Obi-Wan sliced down 4 droids that had the misfortune of being in his vicinity. The door to the other interfighter, which had finally come to a stop, soon opened, and Anakin Skywalker moved to join his former master in battle along with his trusted droid R2-D2. And speaking of droids, a group of enemy robots aimed their blasters at the two friends, and they did not hesitate to open fire. But Anakin swiftly blocked the lasers being shot his way, and he started his own assault on the droids, slicing through his enemies with ease, just like Obi-Wan, who was nearing Anakin's position. As the two Jedi stood back to back, Obi-Wan commanded R2 to locate the Chancellor, the man who was the whole reason why the trio had entered the Invisible Hand in the first place. After taking down the last of the droids in the hangar, R2 moved to a nearby wall, with Obi-Wan and Anakin right behind him. A small mechanical arm then appeared from R2's body and inserted itself into a circular slot that was within the wall. A moment later, the droid projected a holographic image of the ship the heroes were currently on. Obi-Wan pointed to the tall spire of the ship, and the Jedi Master observed how the Chancellor's signal was coming from the observation platform from the top of it. Anakin then sensed a familiar presence, Count Dooku. Or maybe Darth Tyrannus was more appropriate for the man now that he has joined the dark side. Obi-Wan was sure they would be heading into a trap, and Anakin asked what their move should be. The Jedi Master smiled at his former apprentice and simply said they should spring the trap. Anakin smiled back, always happy to see the more playful side of Obi-Wan, even if they were in a dire situation. Maybe the Jedi Knight really was a bad influence on his former master. Location: the Invisible Hand. Observation platform. Time: 1:54 p.m. Anakin and Obi-Wan had finally made it to the top of the spire, entering the room. They rushed to Chancellor Palpatine, who was restrained in a chair on the other side of the room. Obi-Wan casually greeted Palpatine, and Anakin asked if the Chancellor was unharmed. But it seemed that Palpatine's attention was on the entrance doors for some reason. He then mumbled two words, Count Dooku. Turning to the entrance, Obi-Wan and Anakin were indeed greeted by the sight of their enemy, Count Dooku, who had entered the observation platform with two large droids by his sides. But he seemed off. Dooku looked sickly even. Obi-Wan and Anakin shared a look, each thinking the same thing. But despite him obviously feeling ill, Dooku approached the two Jedis with his lightsaber already in hand, but not yet activated. Anakin and Obi-Wan met their foe in the center of the room, ready for a fight even though Chancellor Palpatine had suggested against them battling the Sith Lord. The Jedis knew better than to underestimate Dooku, but they believed they were prepared for the incoming battle. Even if they did not, they would still try. Count Dooku tried to focus on his two opponents, but his vision was gradually becoming more distorted as the seconds passed. The man grabbed a nearby chair to steady himself, and he placed a hand on his forehead before he completely lost his balance. It was then that the Sith Lord must have noticed his pale skin, because his eyes widened in shock and he could not stop turning his hands over and over again. Anakin's grip on his lightsaber tightened and he looked the Sith Lord up and down. It was clear that Dooku was in no condition to fight, but they could not just leave him be, right? Obi-Wan too was conflicted about what they should do, but slowly he stepped closer to Count Dooku and asked for his enemy to surrender. They did not need to fight. Looking away from his hands, Dooku looked back up at Obi-Wan, but what he saw was not the Jedi Knight. It was a creature with skin as black as coal and crimson eyes that shined as bright as the lightsaber Dooku wielded. A demon from the deepest depths of chaos. Count Dooku jumped back and ordered for the huge droids that were still standing by the entrance to fire at the Jedis. The robots quickly did as their master commanded, but Obi-Wan deflected the laser projectiles and made his way up the stairs that led back to the entrance doors. Meanwhile, Anakin finally activated his lightsaber and dropped into a fighting stance. He stated that Dooku should have listened to Obi-Wan and given up when he had the chance. But the Sith Lord ignored Anakin and charged at the Jedi Knight in a rage. The two fighters began their battle, but Anakin soon looked at Dooku in confusion. The Sith Lord's strikes were sloppy, uncoordinated. That was not like Dooku at all. After blocking another attack, Anakin countered with a downward strike and managed to cut both of Count Dooku's hands off. The Sith Lord's lightsaber flew into the air, and Anakin swiftly grabbed the weapon with his left hand. The Jedi Knight then aimed the sabers at Dooku, who fell to his knees in pain. Anakin was about to say something else to his enemy, but Dooku's bleeding wounds caught his attention. Dooku's blood. It was pitch black. Suddenly, the Sith Lord began to convulse, and trails of black blood spewed from his eyes, nose, and mouth. Anakin stepped back and watched Dooku fall face first onto the floor, and soon his body was still. He was dead. But what kind of sickness could have caused Count Dooku to die so suddenly and violently? Anakin just stared down at his enemy's corpse for a moment, not noticing the small drops of Dooku's blood that had splattered onto his hand. Location: Planet Coruscant. Senate Office Building. Time: 3:05 p.m. Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Chancellor Palpatine arrived at the Senate building shortly after their rocky escape from General Grievous's flagship. Palpatine and R2 were the first to get off the transportation ship they had taken to the building, and Anakin was about to follow them. But he stopped when he noticed Obi-Wan was staying on the ship. The Jedi Knight asked if his former master was coming, but Obi-Wan shook his head. The Jedi Master claimed he was not one for politics, and he needed to report to the Jedi Council anyway. Obi-Wan added that someone needed to be the poster boy for the press, but Anakin insisted that they share the credit for saving Chancellor Palpatine. After all, the operation was Obi-Wan's idea. Obi-Wan smiled and waved a dismissive hand, reminding Anakin how it was he had saved his former master and Palpatine, not to mention the fact that the Jedi Knight defeated Count Dooku on his own. Anakin, ever the modest Jedi, argued that if not for Obi-Wan's training, he would not have been able to fight the Sith Lord in the first place. Obi-Wan chuckled at his former student's modesty, but he quickly became concerned when he saw Anakin put a hand on his forehead. The Jedi Master inquired about Anakin's well-being, but the Knight shook his head and claimed it was just a small headache. Nothing to worry about. Obi-Wan nodded, but he was not entirely convinced by Anakin's words. He even debated on whether he should stay with his former student for a while to make sure Anakin was truly all right, but he knew better than to keep the council waiting. Once the meeting with the council was over, Obi-Wan would make sure to return to Anakin to check on him. He hoped nothing was really wrong with the Jedi Knight. Location: Planet Coruscant. Apartment in Senate District. Time: 1:47 a.m. Anakin awoke from his slumber in a panicked state, and his eyes darted to the person still peacefully sleeping by his side. Letting out a sigh of relief, the Jedi pulled the covers from his body and sat on the side of the bed with his head in his hands. It was just a nightmare, he repeated to himself. Padme was right beside him, completely unharmed. Anakin had dreamed of his dear wife dying after giving birth, but he had a feeling that it was much more than just a simple nightmare. What if it was a vision of the future? Such visions were not unusual for Anakin, with one example being how the Jedi predicted his mother's death. A terrible tragedy that Anakin hoped would never come to pass. But there was something else. Something felt strange about the dream Anakin had. And no, it was not only the fact that the Jedi saw Padme dying. There was this presence, like a shadow in the back of Anakin's mind. Maybe it was just his imagination. but still, it scared the man. Location: planet Coruscant, Jedi Temple, High Council Tower. Time: 11:44 a.m. Anakin knew that Chancellor Palpatine's decision to appoint him as a member of the High Council would not go over so well. And unfortunately, he was right. While he was accepted into the council, Mace Windu made it clear that Anakin would not be given the rank of Master. The Jedi Knight was angered by the decision and argued against it. How could he possibly be on the council and not be a Jedi Master? Windu, however, was not having any of it. It didn't, and calmly told Anakin to take a seat while they finished discussing the war. Due to having good relations with the people of planet Kashyyyk, Jedi Master Yoda will be sent along with a battalion of clones to reinforce the Wookiees. Windu concluded the meeting by saying a familiar phrase, which he meant to wish upon the others of the council good luck. May the Force be with you all. As soon as they were out of earshot, Anakin was quick to express his disappointment with the High Council's decision to Obi-Wan. It was an insult and has never happened before, the Jedi Knight said. But Obi-Wan insisted that Anakin should feel honored to be on the council despite his rank, even if the Knight was only accepted for ulterior reasons. While they were walking, Anakin stumbled and had to grab onto the wall to balance himself. Obi-Wan instantly stopped and asked if his former student was all right. Anakin said he suddenly felt lightheaded, but it was nothing serious. But Obi-Wan was not about to let the Knight gloss over an apparent illness like he did the day before. Grabbing Anakin's arm, the Jedi Master practically dragged the younger man to the temple infirmary, disregarding Anakin's demands to stop. Location: planet Coruscant, Temple Infirmary. Time: 12:36 p.m. Dr. Mayer had completed multiple tests on Anakin, and he could see that the Jedi was gradually growing impatient. He was going as fast as he could, but there was not much he could do to speed up the process. But finally, the test results came in, and Mayer immediately frowned upon seeing them. Of course, Anakin and Obi-Wan did not understand what the doctor was so concerned about, since they themselves were not doctors. But Mayer soon remembered that he had patients in the room with him, and he started to explain what was wrong with Anakin. Apparently, a foreign pathogen had been discovered within Anakin's blood, and it was attacking various parts of his body, especially the brain. Anakin froze. That did not sound good at all. Some sort of virus was attacking him from the inside. Was he going to die? Obi-Wan, however, was quick to seek solutions. He asked the doctor if there was anything he could do about the virus. Mayer ran a hand through his hair, unsure of what could be done. This was a pathogen unlike any the doctor has ever seen or heard of before, but that would not discourage him from finding a cure. Mayer will do everything in his power to help Anakin. The doctor just hoped Anakin would live long enough for him to find some sort of antidote. But there was something else Mayer was concerned about: the transmission of the virus. Obi-Wan has been around Anakin the most lately, but it did not seem like the Jedi Master was experiencing any symptoms of an illness. Even so, it may be best if both Anakin and Obi-Wan are put in quarantine until Mayer figures out how exactly the virus is transferred from person to person. The doctor did ask Anakin who else had been in his vicinity for long periods of time recently. They may also need to be quarantined as well. The way Anakin's head shot up and his breathing quickened was a bad sign. There was someone else, and the last thing she needed to be was sick, especially while she was pregnant. Anakin bolted out of the infirmary before Obi-Wan or Mayer could stop him, his only priority at that moment being Padme. Location: planet Coruscant, apartment in Senate District. Time: 1:04 p.m. Bursting through the entrance doors of their shared apartment, Anakin frantically called for Padme as he ran inside. Obi-Wan was right behind him, also concerned about the woman's well-being. Anakin searched in the kitchen, bathroom, and living room. The last place was the bedroom, where he hoped Padme would be there fast asleep like the night before. The Jedi Knight stepped through the doorway to the bedroom, but he instantly froze in his tracks. Indeed, Padme was in the bed, and she was sleeping. But her slumber would last an eternity. Padme's dull, lifeless eyes stared back at Anakin, whose vision was now blurred by the tears quickly forming in his eyes. The Jedi slowly approached the bed and knelt beside it, grabbing Padme's cold hand. They used to be so soft and warm, Anakin thought, and he then allowed for his tears to fall. Anakin just sobbed. Obi-Wan could hear his former student's pitiful wailing, and he took that as his cue to step in to comfort the broken man. The Jedi Master knelt beside Anakin and reached for the younger man's shoulder, but Anakin whispered something that made Obi-Wan stop. The Knight said Padme had been pregnant with their child. Obi-Wan was aware of Anakin's romantic relationship with Padme, but to think that they were about to be parents. The Jedi Master could not fathom the pain Anakin must be feeling right now, but he knew what the younger man was thinking, that he was responsible for Padme's death. But the longer he stared at Padme's corpse, Anakin knew it was true. This was his fault. If he had gone to the doctor sooner and stayed away from Padme until he was cured of the virus. But of course, Anakin allowed his stubbornness to get in the way. It was just a headache, he said, and further proof of his stupidity lay in the trails of black blood leaking from Padme's eyes and nose. The same thing had happened to Dooku just before his death. He must have contracted the virus and transferred it to Anakin somehow. So, that meant the Jedi Knight had the virus before they arrived on Coruscant, before he reunited with his beloved wife. How could he have been so stupid? No, Anakin thought as he rose from the floor and stormed out of the bedroom, Obi-Wan once again on his heels. It was this war. It needed to end, now. Knowing Anakin was not in the right state of mind, Obi-Wan grabbed his arm and pleaded with his former student to not do anything he will regret. His grief and rage over Padme's death is clouding his judgment. But Anakin claimed that his vision has never been clearer. The only way to truly stop the Galactic War was to destroy the enemy completely. And by that, Anakin was planning on destroying the Separatist Council. As they argued, the two men failed to see Padme's hand twitch ever so slightly. Her once lifeless eyes were now darting across the room, the slitted pupils narrowing when she saw Anakin and Obi-Wan nearby. Padme then slowly sat up in the bed, and a low, beast-like growl escaped her throat. It was a sound no human could possibly make, but the noise drew Anakin and Obi-Wan's attention away from one another and back to Padme. They both stared wide-eyed at the woman, who they believed to be dead just a moment ago. Obi-Wan was cautious of the crazed look on Padme's face. Anakin could not care less. He was just happy to see his wife was alive. Walking towards the woman, Anakin held out his arms to Padme, wanting nothing more than to embrace her. But Obi-Wan called out to his former student and used the Force to grab Anakin and pull him away from his wife. And it was a good thing too, because just a second later, Padme roared as she pounced in Anakin's direction, intending to bite the Jedi with her rotten, blackened teeth. The Jedi Knight was pulled back to Obi-Wan, and the older man demanded that Anakin draw out his lightsaber now. Anakin could not believe his former master's words. Did Obi-Wan really believe that the Knight would ever harm Padme? Because if he did, he was sadly mistaken. But if Anakin was not strong enough to do what needed to be done, then so be it. With gritted teeth, Obi-Wan activated his lightsaber, and he told Anakin to leave because the younger man would only get in the way. However, Obi-Wan did not expect what Anakin would do next. The Jedi Knight did pull out his saber, but not to fight Padme, to fight Obi-Wan. Aiming his weapon at the Master, Anakin stated that he would not allow Obi-Wan to hurt his beloved wife, no matter what. Obi-Wan kept his eyes on the rogue Padme, but responded by saying that the woman was no longer the person Anakin fell in love with. Now it was just an abomination that happened to have her face, but just as those words left Obi-Wan's mouth, Padme attacked again, and managed to leap onto Anakin, pushing the man to the ground on his back. The woman then started biting at her husband as Anakin put his arm against her neck in an attempt to keep her back. It was incredible how strong Padme was right now, but Anakin still did not want to harm her in any way. As Padme's mouth neared Anakin's throat, something sliced through the woman's neck. Anakin watched in horror as Padme's head slowly slid from her neck and rolled onto the floor beside him. Her body went completely limp on top of him, and the Jedi Knight looked up to Obi-Wan, who was the one responsible for Padme's sudden decapitation. The older Jedi stared back at Anakin with an apologetic look on his face, despite knowing he had to do something to save his former student's life, even if it meant taking away Anakin's one true love for good. After the tragic death of Padme Amidala, her secret love affair with Anakin has come to light, and now the Chosen One is going to be put on trial. But considering how he lost his pregnant wife, his freedom due to now being quarantined, and how he may lose his status as a Jedi, Anakin feels like he is being punished enough. However, the young man receives help from an unexpected ally, and with their help, Anakin will exact his revenge against the Separatists and the Republic. Anakin Skywalker did not resist as he was placed inside a quarantine cell, the glass walls taking away any privacy the Jedi probably would have had if he was put into a normal cell. Not that that was the better option of the two, of course. If he was his usual self, Anakin would have loudly expressed his disapproval over the small room. But that was not the case. Instead, Anakin sat quietly at the end of his Ned, which had a simple gray cover with a matching pillow. It was not much, but it was better than nothing. At his right, the young man could hear a metal door sliding open and then shut. The person who entered the room was Anakin's former master and friend, Obi-Wan Kenobi. The older man walked to a chair sitting in front of his friend's cell and sat down. Obi-Wan began by asking Anakin how he was doing. It was a stupid question, but the Jedi Master could not help but ask. Of course, when Anakin did not respond, Obi-Wan was not surprised. The younger Jedi has been silent ever since they left his apartment, the one he once shared with his wife Padme, until the terrible incident that resulted in her death. Ever since he was put into confinement, Anakin replayed the scene over and over again in his mind. Her blood-stained face, her narrowed cat-like eyes, the guttural sounds coming from her throat like a beast trying to intimidate its prey. But it was the image of Padme's decapitated head rolling onto the floor that Anakin could not get out of his head. For a brief moment, just before her head fell from her body, Anakin could have sworn he saw a glimpse of his beautiful wife staring back at him, as if she was finally able to break free of the madness that had suddenly taken a hold of her. Padme could have been saved, the Jedi thought. Obi-Wan's voice pulled Anakin from his thoughts and began talking about his recent meeting with the High Council. He shook his head, knowing that his friend was probably going to hate him for what he was about to say, if Anakin did not hate his former master already. But Obi-Wan was not about to lie to his fellow Jedi Masters, so he was forced to tell them everything. including Anakin's secret relationship with Padme and their unborn child. Finally, Anakin lifted his head up and acknowledged Obi-Wan's existence. The older Jedi could see the barely suppressed anger in Anakin's eyes, but he tried to justify his actions, saying it would have been worse for both of them if he had lied. Obi-Wan did not want to do it, but he had no choice. Even so, the Jedi Master was quick to defend Anakin's actions and pleaded with the Council to be lenient with his friend's punishment. He did not believe Anakin's lightsaber and status as a Jedi should be taken away because of his affair. Indeed, that was the punishment for the Jedi who decided to pursue love. The reason the Jedi were banned from having romantic relationships was because they can lead to strong emotions. Adoration, compassion, happiness. Those were the obvious ones, but most seem to look past the negative emotions that can also be associated with love. Obsessiveness, jealousy, and sadness are just a few. These negative emotions can bring anyone over to the dark side, including Jedi. Anakin broke the Jedi code, and will soon have to face the consequences of his actions, but that was not what concerned the young Jedi. If his affair with Padme was made known to the public, it could tarnish his wife's reputation. Anakin could only imagine what terrible things the public would say about Padme, because she willingly began a relationship with a Jedi, knowing what would happen if their love was found out. Anakin attempted to change the subject, feeling as though he would do something he regretted if he and Obi-Wan continued this conversation. He remembered Horus, and then the young Jedi asked Obi-Wan and Furi if there were any updates about the virus that currently plagued him. The Jedi Master, who could see that Anakin was still upset, decided to answer his friend's question so as to not anger the younger man further. Obi-Wan explained that Dr. Mayer believes that transmission of the virus occurs when someone comes in contact with the bodily fluids of an infected individual. Blood, saliva, sweat, any of it could be fatal. Oh no. Anakin looked down at his hands with wide eyes. Was that how Padme contracted the disease? A simple kiss would have been enough. The thought hurt Anakin even more, and only made him blame himself for her death even more. As if reading his mind, Obi-Wan instantly tried to comfort Anakin and say that the younger man was not at fault for what happened to Padme. Anakin did not know, so how could he blame himself? Obi-Wan reached out and placed his hands on the glass, rambling about how they would get through this and everything would be alright. But Anakin could not bring himself to believe anything that the older Jedi was saying. Suddenly, the metal cup that was sitting on the table beside Anakin flew across the cell to hit the wall, causing Obi-Wan to stand from his seat with his hand hovering above the handle of his lightsaber. As cracks spread from the area where the glass was struck, Obi-Wan looked through the now broken wall at Anakin, who stared back with the deepest scowl on his face. Anakin then quietly demanded for Obi-Wan to leave. He wanted to be left alone. Location: Planet Coruscant. Apartment in Senate District. Time: 12:01 p.m. Anakin overlooked the balcony, a soft smile on his face as he admired the city before him. Coruscant was as busy as ever, but the constant activity was somewhat comforting to the Jedi Knight. Behind him, a familiar figure slowly approached Anakin. Once she was close enough to her husband, Padme wrapped her arms around Anakin and allowed her forehead to rest on the man's back. His smile widened, and Anakin placed his hands over his wife's own and gently massaged Padme's knuckles with his thumb. The Jedi loved how soft and smooth Padme's skin felt under his touch. Turning around, Anakin was greeted with the lovely face of Padme, her curly hair cascading down her shoulders, and her brown eyes shining under the sunlight. A goddess among men, Anakin thought, as his arms found their way around his wife's waist, and the Jedi pulled Padme closer to him. But Anakin suddenly frowned when he noticed tears streaming down Padme's face. Black tears. No, no, no. Panic quickly rose within Anakin, and his grip around Padme tightened as he felt the woman going limp in his arms. The couple fell to the ground with the Jedi holding on to Padme, who was now completely motionless, and the light in her eyes had dimmed. Anakin did not even try to hold his tears back, and he sobbed uncontrollably into Padme's shoulder, rocking the woman's cold body against him. But his mourning was interrupted when someone else appeared on the balcony before the couple. Anakin looked up, and a small gasp escaped his lips as he recognized the person who stood before him now. Obi-Wan. His lightsaber already in hand, Obi-Wan stared down at the body in Anakin's hands, his eyes filled with disgust and hatred. It was a look Anakin was not used to, since the older Jedi was usually kind and calm. This was not Obi-Wan, at least not the one Anakin knew. Obi-Wan raised his lightsaber over Padme, and Anakin instantly shielded his wife's body with his own, shouting no as he did so. But just as Obi-Wan's saber came flying down towards him, everything went black. Location: planet Coruscant. Jedi Temple. Infirmary. Time: 1:23 a.m. Waking up in a cold sweat, Anakin shot up from his bed and frantically looked around the room. It took a moment for the Jedi to realize where he was, but when he did, he felt nothing. Maybe he should have felt relieved that he was no longer in that nightmare, but it was not like Anakin was in a better situation now, not when Padme was still dead. Anakin looked down at his trembling hands, his skin growing paler by the hour. The virus was taking its toll, and it may not be long before he followed his wife to the afterlife. But that brought up another concern. Obi-Wan was there, so the Jedi Knight was not mistaken. Padme came back to life. Yes, she was not exactly herself, but Padme did come back to Anakin for just a moment, and then Obi-Wan took her away again. They could have found a way to fix her, Anakin thought, but Obi-Wan ruined everything. Anakin clenched his hands into fists, his anger growing once more. He gritted his teeth as he stood from his bed and paced back and forth throughout his small cell. It was Obi-Wan's fault. He killed Padme. It was all his fault. Anakin suddenly froze in his tracks. No, that was not true. Obi-Wan was not to blame for any of this. It has to be the virus, Anakin thought. It was making him think irrationally. Taking a deep breath, some clarity was brought back to Anakin's mind, and he sat back down on his bed. The Jedi Knight put his head in his hands and started mumbling, asking himself what he was going to do. What could he do? This was so frustrating. Just as he thought that, the entrance door slid open, and Anakin sighed. He was sure Obi-Wan was the one paying him a late visit, because the older Jedi was the only one who had visited Anakin since he was quarantined. The Knight told Obi-Wan that he was not interested in talking right now, but when he turned around to face his friend, Anakin was surprised to see someone else where Obi-Wan should be standing. It was Chancellor Palpatine. The Chancellor walked over to the lone chair in front of the quarantine cell and greeted Anakin with a kind smile. The old man then asked how Anakin was doing. Was he in any pain? Anakin opened his mouth to answer Palpatine, but he stopped himself. Anakin really wanted to say that yes, he was hurting. And no, it was not just from the mystery virus killing him from the inside out. The Jedi had just lost his wife, his freedom. Anakin was feeling many things and nothing at all simultaneously. It was complicated and difficult to explain. Palpatine, understanding the young Jedi's hesitation, nodded his head and said to Anakin that it was all right. He knew Anakin was going through much right now, but he wanted to let the Jedi know that he did care. Or at least Palpatine seemed to care. Changing the subject, Anakin asked the Chancellor what he was doing here, especially at this late hour. Palpatine sighed, and after a moment of silence, he finally answered the younger man's question. He explained that the Jedi Council would come to a decision about Anakin's fate in the morning. Anakin will have a proper trial, but Palpatine had to be honest and say that he did not believe that the Council would show any leniency, even if Anakin was the chosen one. Anakin had expected as much, even with Obi-Wan's pleas to the Council, but he still appreciated his friend's help, and the young Jedi made a promise to apologize to Obi-Wan next time they met. While Anakin was thinking this, Palpatine suddenly stated that he had something to tell the Jedi Knight. This caught Anakin's attention immediately. What could the Chancellor possibly want to tell him? It sounded like it was serious by the tone in Palpatine's voice. Crossing his arms, Palpatine leaned back in his chair and asked Anakin if he had any idea of the origins of the virus he was infected with. Anakin frowned and shook his head, but it seemed that the Chancellor knew something the Jedi did not. So, Anakin inquired about the disease and if Palpatine was withholding some information from him. The Chancellor shook his head and went on to say that he found something that may give them the answers they needed. He pulled something from his cloak, and it was revealed to be a small prism, which was made out of black crystal, and the inside glowed a bright crimson. Anakin instantly stood from his bed once again, and he stomped over the wall before Palpatine, his hands resting on the glass as he stared at the holocron. The Jedi then asked how Palpatine was able to access the holocron, since they both knew only Siths could activate those specific devices. The same could be said for Jedi holocrons, which could only be accessed by the Jedi. Palpatine chuckled and instead answered Anakin's question with a question. "What do you think, young Skywalker?" As if Anakin should have already known the answer to his own question. But it did not take long for the Jedi to piece things together. If only Anakin had his lightsaber right now. Location: Planet Coruscant. Jedi Temple, Infirmary. Time, 6:59 a.m. Dr. Meyer let out a big yawn as the door opened to his office. That was not unusual because Meyer was never a morning person, but this time, his exhaustion was due to the doctor staying up so late the night before. Meyer could not sleep with the strange virus haunting his thoughts, and he had spent all night doing research to find where the disease originated from. In the end, however, he did not discover any useful information. Perhaps if Meyer did more tests on Anakin Skywalker, perhaps then he could learn more about the virus. After all, he was the only infected citizen here on Coruscant as far as everyone knew, so the Jedi was needed if there was a chance Meyer could find a cure. And that was a big if. Fortunately, the doctor was not alone in this, and he has already contacted other medical professionals around Coruscant to ask for their help. Dr. Meyer opened another door in the back of his office, which led to the quarantine cell where Anakin was currently being held. He greeted his patient with a simple good morning and walked over to the cell, but he froze when he noticed that the cell was empty. Anakin was gone. Oh, this could not be good. Location: Planet Coruscant. Jedi Temple, High Council Tower. Time: 7:03 a.m. Again, the Jedi Council sat within their meeting room, discussing what to do about the virus. Fortunately, no one else seemed to be infected with the disease besides Anakin, so keeping him in quarantine was the best option right now. As for the Jedi's punishment for his secret romance with Padme, they would do as was stated in the Jedi Code. If Anakin had a simple relationship with Naboo's senator that was not bound by marriage, then maybe things would have gone differently. but that was not the case. And now that they knew Padme was with child before her death, Anakin's actions would not be tolerated. The Council had come to a decision. Anakin will be expelled from the Jedi Order. Most of the members were in agreement, except one, and it came as no surprise that Obi-Wan was against the verdict. The other Jedi Masters understood how much Obi-Wan cared for Anakin, but his relationship with his former student was clouding his judgment. Personal feelings should not get in the way of these important decisions. But just as they came to an agreement, Dr. Mayer burst through the entrance doors and immediately started spewing apologies for his sudden appearance. But he needed to inform them of Anakin's escape from quarantine. The doctor explained how he entered his office a little while ago and saw that Anakin was no longer in his cell. He escaped. The Council instantly jumped into action, and they each moved to search for the missing patient. Obi-Wan was the last to leave the meeting room, but he stopped when a memory came to mind. After Padme's death, Anakin spoke about being the one to end the Galactic War, and he would go after the source of their suffering. Obi-Wan knew where his former student had gone, and he needed to find Anakin before the other members of the Jedi Council did. Location: Planet Mustafar, Kleger Corp mining facility. Time: 9:36 a.m. Jumping onto another hovering platform, Obi-Wan and Anakin circled one another with their lightsabers in hand. Obi-Wan pleaded with the younger Jedi to surrender and come back with him to Coruscant. If Anakin returned willingly, then perhaps the Jedi Council will show mercy. But Anakin knew better, and so did his former master. The Jedi Knight shouted at Obi-Wan to stop with his lies, and added that the Council was not doing enough to stop the war. So, he was going to do things his way. Obi-Wan told himself that the virus was messing with Anakin's mind and causing him to act insane. He had to get Anakin back to Coruscant so he could be treated. They were going to find a cure. They just needed a little more time. And speaking of the virus, Anakin covered his mouth as he had another coughing fit. But this time, when he looked down at his hand, the young Jedi could see drops of black blood on it. He was running out of time, but Anakin swore to complete his mission before the disease overwhelmed him. The Separatists would fall today, and soon, the Republic will follow. It was then that Obi-Wan came to the realization that his former student was too far gone. The corruption of Anakin's mind was total. He did not want to believe it, but Obi-Wan knew it was true. So, with a heavy heart, the Jedi Master tightened his grip on his lightsaber and did his best to steel his resolve. Obi-Wan then charged at Anakin and slashed downward at his opponent, who clumsily dodged the strike. Anakin's vision was beginning to blur, and he shook his head to try and clear it to no avail. But the young Jedi continued to fight, and with each new cut he gained from Obi-Wan's attacks, Anakin's mind was driven deeper into madness. With the last of his strength, the Jedi Knight aimed to slice through Obi-Wan's torso. But Anakin was too slow. Obi-Wan easily stepped out of the way of Anakin's incoming attack and countered with one of his own. But even Obi-Wan was surprised when he realized that his saber had gone straight through Anakin's heart. That was not his intention. Obi-Wan had been so caught up in the battle that his instincts just took over. Obi-Wan looked between the weapon that had pierced through his opponent's chest and Anakin's shocked expression. His eyes filled with sadness due to his former master's betrayal. Anakin thought they were friends, but he had been wrong. He should have known after Obi-Wan so effortlessly chopped off Padme's head. Obi-Wan finally pulled his lightsaber out of Anakin's body, after what felt like an eternity of them just staring at one another. The older Jedi then reached out to his friend, but Anakin shoved him away with the little strength he had left. Obi-Wan will never forget Anakin's last words just before the young Jedi fell into the lava river below. "I hate you." Obi-Wan tried to grab the Jedi Knight, but it was too late. As Anakin fell, the Jedi Master could only watch, and with tears in his eyes, Obi-Wan whispered to himself, "I know." Location: Planet Mustafar, Klegger Corp mining facility. Time: 12:22 p.m. A few hours after a sorrowful Obi-Wan left Mustafar to report back to the Jedi Council, Chancellor Palpatine made an unexpected appearance on the planet. 2 shock troopers were by the Chancellor's side, and when they reached the bank of the lava river, one of them pointed out something in the distance, a body, badly charred and motionless. Palpatine was sure he knew whose corpse was lying on the bank, and he shook his head in disappointment. Palpatine thought back to his earlier meeting with Anakin in his quarantine cell. Upon opening the holocron, the 2 men learned of the virus and its original purpose. It was supposed to be an elixir that granted eternal life, but apparently something went wrong. A shame, really. It could have been useful. Stepping closer to Anakin's body, Palpatine mumbled something about how the young Jedi had so much potential, if only the circumstances had been different. The Chancellor moved to walk away, but noticed how Anakin's finger twitched ever so slightly. No, Palpatine thought. It must have been his imagination. If only he knew the full story of Anakin and Obi-Wan's encounter with the briefly resurrected Padme.